big picture for me always. And I used to get frustrated with my legislature, who seemed to be concerned about short-term things or things that weren't to the bigger issues that we were dealing with. And I remember when I told a friend of mine, Mike Bloomberg, that I was going to be running for the Senate, and he, having been an executive too, gave me this gruff answer, almost like I disappointed a big brother, who, by the way, Mayor Bloomberg, for those interested in politics, gave me the best advice in politics I've ever gotten, which is, Corey, before you become a mayor, become a billionaire. And
not beholden to anybody forever then, right?
Exactly. But he just said to me something that I'll never forget. He said, Corey, legislators in Congress are concerned with these first three priorities before anything else. And then he said, re-election, re-election, re-election. And so now I've been down there for 2 years, and we put a lot of great people in a broken system where there's a lot of things that I think work against us getting things done, from the campaign finance system that is profoundly broken and I think perverse, to just the way we draw our congressional lines. And in fact, I often say that if we were running this country like America Inc., we would be making much better decisions about what to do. Companies are often concerned with their physical plan, staying ahead of the competition, the quality of their employees. We've stopped investing in our physical plan, our infrastructure, the way we should. We've stopped concerned about staying ahead of the competition, research and development. We're going down on that percentage of our GDP. And then the quality of our employees, the training of the next generation of American workers, we're not doing the common sense things that our competitors are doing. But this is the final thing I'll say to you, who used a very strong word, which was hate. And I'm not going to project to you onto you cynicism, but I often say cynicism is a refuge for cowards, that it is a toxic spiritual state, that it so clouds our ability to see faint possibilities and hope amidst the glaring problems that we often wipe our hands of any engagement whatsoever. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in our democracy is because of feelings like you have, more and more people get less involved, which then creates the very problems that we are worried about, because it's the lack of accountability. The Colosseum in Rome, the Latin says, who will watch the watchers? And the best example I give this, and forgive me if this sounds a little partisan to you, but in 2008, when I went to vote, there was a line wrapped around my voting place like I'd never seen before. Barack Obama versus John McCain, and the turnout all across New Jersey was like set records. 1 year later, is the gubernatorial race in New Jersey. John Corzine, incumbent governor, running against a guy you may never heard of, but his name is Chris Christie. And there was no line. I went in and voted easily. I hugged the poll worker that was there because she looked lonely. And then John Corzine lost, Chris Christie won. And if the turnout in urban spaces especially had been just maybe 75% of what it had been the year before, John Corzine would have won. Different priorities. And so Chris Christie gets in office and pulls us out of what's called regional greenhouse gas agreements to lower pollutants in the air. Remember, in cities like mine, asthma rates are incredibly high. He cuts funding to Planned Parenthoods. People are coming to me about Planned Parenthood doors closing. He lowers the earned income tax credit, which is a virtual tax increase on low-income workers. He cuts funding to cities. Every major city in New Jersey had to lay off cops or cut their police force. So people start coming to me complaining about all of this, and I say, what are you talking about? Why are we complaining or pointing the fingers at Chris Christie when it really wasn't about him? It was about our lack of action and engagement. And so when I encounter skepticism about politics, I just tell people, don't expect the politics of our country to change unless you do. Who are we in this day and age where we are, relative to the globe, enjoying such comforts and conveniences? Why would we give up right now or surrender to cynicism at a time that our politics and our nation demand more engagement, or else we will start to veer off course and become a country that's a shadow of our greatness of the past?
Cory Booker isn't running for president yet. Don't be surprised if he does someday. And if he does, he will likely become a sudden and indisputable expert on the dire state of the American economy, just like all the people running for president this year.
This country is in big trouble. We don't win anymore. We lose to China. We lose to Mexico, both in trade and at the border. We lose to everybody.
We must raise incomes for hardworking Americans so they can afford a middle-class life.
The greed of the billionaire class, the greed of Wall Street, is destroying this economy.
The sad reality is big government, massive taxes, massive regulation doesn't work.
Since most presidential candidates in this country traditionally aren't economists, that's not the case everywhere, by the way, we thought it might be worth speaking with someone who is an economist.
I'm just a regular economist who has a fancy title.
Robert Gordon is an economist at Northwestern University and the author of a book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. Now, think about that title for a moment. The Rise and Fall of American Growth. So, Gordon's view may be as dark as all those presidential candidates' views, but while politicians generally look for easy villains, immigrants, or China, Wall Street, Gordon takes a less, shall we say, hysterical view of things. It is a view based on how innovation and inventions affect the economy, especially the inventions of the past few decades.
The big debate is about how important these new inventions will be, how rapidly they will be diffusing throughout the economy. And that's where we get into some of the controversy that's been caused by my book.
Anyway, like I said, Gordon is an academic.
I'm Stanley G. Harris, professor of the social sciences at Northwestern University.
Professor of social sciences, not professor of economics. Why is that?
That sounds better. And it wasn't my idea. I didn't give myself that title. It was made up for me.
So you're not on the side an anthropologist and a psychologist and all that?
No, but I have gotten deeply into history.
Gordon does indeed go deep into history, examining the trajectory of economic growth over the last few millennia.
We had virtually no progress in human life between the Roman Empire and the late Middle Ages. Studies of England, where they have some of the best data and statistics, show that over 400 years, between 1300 and 1700, economic growth was only at a rate of 0.2% a year. And to put that into concrete terms, something growing that slowly at 0.2% requires 350 years to double.
Not only was growth extraordinarily slow, but even as new inventions came along, steam-powered railroads and a broader network of food distribution, they didn't exactly transform society overnight.
One of the things that keyed my interest in the great inventions was a paperback book that I found in a bed and breakfast in Michigan, where guests were invited to leave books and pick them up. And so I picked up this book. It was a book by Otto Bettmann of the famous Bettmann Photographic Archives, and it was full of wonderful line drawings and cartoons of the horrors of railroad travel in the late 19th century with boilers that would blow up, of milk that was adulterated and mixed with water or chalk, the complete lack of protection of the quality of the foods. And so this set of horrors of how terrible life was in the old days led me naturally down the path of exploring what were the things that changed us and improved it.
Gordon looked hard at what's generally called the First Industrial Revolution, which began in the mid-18th century.
When we had the invention of steam engines, steamships, locomotives, factories making cotton fabrics, and then the telegraph. All those things were invented in the century between 1770 and 1870, and they set the stage for the inventions that happened after 1870.
And that's when the Second Industrial Revolution would begin. We'll get there, but first, as Gordon was saying about the stage-setting inventions of the First Industrial Revolution,
one example of setting the stage was the telegraph, which was the single biggest invention in human history in shortening the time it took to communicate a fact or a piece of news. Before the telegraph, which was invented in 1844, the fastest that news could travel was by the speed of a horse or a sailing ship. And indeed, we have a famous example of the Battle of New Orleans, won by Andrew Jackson in January 1815, which took place 3 weeks after the peace treaty was signed between Britain and the United States, ending the War of 1812. So after the telegraph, of course, the human mind started imagining, well, what if we could find a way of allowing people to talk over these wires instead of just sending ... Morse codes? And that dream was realized fairly promptly in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell and his competing inventor. Bell beat the competitor, whose name was Elisha Gray. Bell beat him to the U.S. Patent Office by about 3 hours.
As we all know, the telephone was but one of many, many, many inventions produced during the Second Industrial Revolution.
The Second Industrial Revolution included electricity, the internal combustion engine, chemicals, plastics, running water, the conquest of infectious diseases, the conquest of infant mortality, the development of processed food, the fact that women no longer had to make their clothes at home but could buy them either in department stores or in mail order catalogs. So all of those things, every dimension of human life was affected by the Second Industrial Revolution, with the inventions mainly taking place between 1870 and the early 1900s, and having their big impact on such economic measures as productivity during the middle part of the 20th century, especially from 1920 to 1970.
Now, remember what Robert Gordon said about the rate of growth between 1300 and 1700?
Something growing that slowly at 0.2% requires 350 years to double.
And how did that compare to the Second Industrial Revolution?
Since 1870, the amount of time that it's taken for the standard of living to double has been more like 30 years, not 350 years.
Wow. Think about that. If you had the good fortune to be born in the early 20th century, let's say, rather than the early 19th century, well, that was a lot of good fortune. Okay, but wait a minute. As lucky as you might have been to be born in the early 20th century, how much luckier still would it be to have been born in the mid or late 20th century? Because that's when we got the vaunted Third Industrial Revolution.
The Third Industrial Revolution started off around 1960 with the first mainframe computer and went further into the mini computer, the personal computer in 1980, and then followed by the marriage of communications with computers that we call the internet, or the dot-com revolution that happened in the late 1990s. So all of these changes radically changed our ability to process information. Along the way, we had a similar revolution in entertainment. So the Third Industrial Revolution includes entertainment, information through the computers, and the communication as we moved from landline phones to what we can call dumb mobile phones in the 1990s, then into smart mobile phones in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Third Industrial Revolution. Each of those fields was dramatically and completely changed, particularly the information processing by the computer and the invention of such things as e-commerce and search engines and email and web browsing. But those inventions, as monumental as they were taking place just in a narrow slice of human life in terms of the economy.
And this brings us to the central argument of Robert Gordon's book, the argument that many economists and others are not willing to accept, at least not without a fight. Gordon believes that as bright and shiny and wonderful as the many manifestations of this Third Industrial Revolution may be, well, they can't compare to the more essential inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution when it comes to increasing the average person's standard of living. Moreover, Gordon has come to think that the great inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution were a one-time event, and that the resulting spike in American prosperity was therefore also a one-time event, which may account for all the gloom and doom on the presidential campaign trail, even though you could easily argue that more people around the world are better off today than they've ever been. We all know that leaping forward feels a lot better than inching forward, especially when the nature of the inventions that we've been given these last few decades make it seem as if we are leaping forward.
Our total spending on all electronic communications and computer devices, on entertainment, on the services that provide us with internet services and telephone services, you add that up and it's only about 7% of the economy. That leaves the other 93% of the economy that has not been nearly so profoundly affected by the third industrial revolution.
It sounds as though your argument is essentially that many of the inventions provided by the digital revolution, while exciting and appealing and sexy, and maybe because they are so sexy, they gain more of our attention than they warrant, that as exciting and sexy, etc., as they are, that they are primarily refinements of previously existing things. So they make transportation more portable or convenient, or communication more the same, shopping more the same, but that they don't stand at all in comparison to the breakthroughs of the earlier technological revolution.
I think they're breakthroughs, and indeed, if we look at business practices and procedures, we had a complete change from paper and file cabinets, calculating machines and typewriters into the modern world of flat screens and search engines and electronic storage and electronic catalogs. That was a profound transformation that affected the lives of almost everybody who works in an office. And it took place over the 25 years or so between 1980 and 2005. Yes, during the heyday of the dot-com revolution, we had our nationwide measures of progress, namely productivity growth, catching up briefly for about a decade to the kinds of measures of progress that we had back in the second industrial revolution. So it was transformative, but it didn't last long. The revival of productivity growth occurred only between about 1995 and 2005, in contrast to the similar big surge of productivity growth created by the second industrial revolution that lasted for a full 50 years from 1920 to 1970. So it's a matter not of whether we had breakthroughs, but how big and important they were and how much they boosted the amount people could produce per hour of work.
So this brings us really, I guess, to part of the controversy of your book, which is also brings us to the title of your book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. So as much as one can get excited about the inventions and the technology of the past, let's say, 40 years, your argument is much broader than that, which is that growth has peaked as we know it, and that, if I understand correctly, in your view, it will never resume as we had it before. Is that about right?
That's about right, and let's provide an order of magnitude. We have a measure of the impact of innovations that economists call total factor productivity, and that tells us how much progress our economy is making relative to the hours of work that we put in and relative to the number of machines that we use. And so improvements in efficiency per unit of labor and per unit of machine is called total factor productivity, and you might just translate that into simple words, the impact of innovation. Well, our economist measures of that growth rate were 3 times as fast between 1920 and 1970 as they have been in the 45 years since 1970. That's the sense in which the data give an unambiguous answer, that we had the rise of economic growth through the middle of the 20th century, and then a falling off, a slackening of the pace of innovation and economic growth since then.
Coming up on Freakonomics Radio, if you don't like what Robert Gordon has to say about the past, you almost certainly won't like what he has to say about the future.
It means as many people will be falling back as those who are moving ahead.
And please take advantage of our free weekly Freakonomics Radio podcast, which you can find at Freakonomics.com, on iTunes, or any other podcast delivery system. Thank you.